Hi, we continue in Luke 11 today after Jesus offered his disciples what we know as the Lord's Prayer and then continues with a supposition about a midnight visitor. So as we enter into the scene, we're continuing, as you can see on the right side of the screen, in the journey from Jerusalem chiasm. And as we've been noting, it's rather loose chiasm. It's not as tightly paralleled as a number of the smaller units we've seen, but it does structure the large picture so that we're going down this direction here and then back up this direction here. And the particular situation we're in here, the story of the friend at midnight, is very closely parallel to the unjust judge in chapter 18. We'll look at the comparison after we've been through this one and we get to chapter 18. But as we looked at last time, the thread of this chapter, which I think fits together nicely, as you can see on this little chart, unlike some scholars who see the first part is about prayer and the second part is about something else, Jesus' authority or demons or something, I think there's a consistent pattern here in this chapter about prayer and judgment. And we saw the first part where Jesus responds to one of the disciples' requests, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples to pray, and he did. But now we get to this story, which seems to come out of nowhere. As we see in verse 5, the disciples haven't said anything and there's no questions raised. So he's just offering this in addition to the prayer for reasons we don't know, so we have to discern them. And as some scholars have suggested, and I'll point them out to you in just a moment, some have argued that this story is here for those who aren't sure whether God is really listening, for those who, in the dominant discourse of the empire, whether that's the Roman talk or the talk from within the Jewish world controlled by the Roman Empire, have understood that God doesn't care about them or doesn't care about their needs. The sources we're going to look at that help us with this, one here from James Metzger, as you can see here, God as friend, reading these passages with a hermeneutic of suffering. If you're not a biblical scholar, you might not know what the hermeneutic it means. That just means the interpretive lens. So what he's looking at here is how to read this story from the perspective of suffering people. In a similar way here from Van Ton Nguyen, who's a priest in Vietnam, and he, as the bolded part there shows, reading it closely from its Greco-Roman context and interpreting it from an Asian perspective, will reveal there's a double shame element at play. And he's reading that from the perspective of hospitality in Vietnamese culture, which may well be similar to what we can imagine in the story of our text. So as we've been doing, we're also looking at key words here. So we looked last time at how the hour was key to the Lord's Prayer, of how much Jesus was about teaching them that they're praying collectively for their collective fate, a lifestyle, a way of being, not just their individual peccadillos, as one source we noted last time differentiated. But here we see the plain parallel is friends and asking. And the asking is, of course, at first in the story, asking about your neighbor, but obviously it ends up being explicitly about your heavenly Father will give the Holy Spirit to those who ask. So we already know the ending. This is not a spoiler we're giving away. It's really about the question, does God listen or not? And as Metzger notes, there are a number of possible reasons why people might imagine that the God that Jesus is proclaiming isn't interested in them. So as Metzger notes from several elements in Luke's Gospel, we can hear that it's implied that some would hold that God might deceive or harm them, and that's in the passage that follows around Beelzebub. But later we'll see worried incessantly about acquiring the basic necessities of food, drink, and clothing in the next chapter. Both earlier and later believe very little was possible with God, and also later in the story, the unjust judge and the widow had lost heart and ceased praying, presumably because God was too slow to respond. As we already saw in chapter 7, we're not persuaded that God presently, quote-unquote, looked favorably upon them, or had ceased expecting that God would intervene in human affairs and work for good in the world. So with all those in mind, things that Luke acknowledges within the story, and there may well be more, Jesus tells this little story to try to encourage people to believe that God is more interested in them than even a recalcitrant neighbor. And as many have noted, this is meant to be a funny story. As my note here from Duell has below, a prime example of observational comedy in its revelation of the true nature of both friendship and annoyance. Let's look how this is structured. Nobody has done more to help us understand this passage than Bailey, and although the book that this is from, Prophets and Poets, is 4 decades old now, it really continues to shape biblical scholarship, and he was quite insightful about parables. And I haven't called this a parable yet because the text doesn't call it a parable, and actually there's no particular reason to think it is. It's simply an illustration of a situation in life that he proposes. It's not meant allegorically, although some can imagine it is. It's really a comparison with friends' behavior and God's behavior. It's not that God is the recalcitrant neighbor whose children are in bed and the door's locked, that's not God at all. So one could really ask whether it's a parable or simply an illustration that he uses to compare their behavior with God's behavior. But Bailey shows, as you can see on the right side of the screen here, kind of a double chiasmic structure. So what will not happen in 3 parts: the request, the reason for the request, and an appeal to duty; the duty refused, the reasons for the refusal, and the request refused; and then what will happen. That he will not answer the request, that he has arisen, but he does it not for friendship's sake, but for honor's sake, and will arise and grant the request. So we see the symmetry of these verses here that we're going to look at. And at the very beginning of this is the question of a friend, and you can see even in just English, friend, friend, friend here. So let's look at friend in Luke Acts and realize the social context of this. As many scholars have noted, Nguyen in his piece highlights this as well. Friend is philos is more of a category in Greek philosophy, especially for Aristotle, than it was in the Hebrew Bible, where neighbor is more of a category. So sometimes the Hebrew is translated as plesios, neighbor, plesion, as we've seen in the story of the Good Samaritan, but sometimes it's translated philos, because there just really isn't that separate category of friend the way it is for philosophers in Greek. So of all the philosophical comments on friendship, let's look at a piece of the classic one from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And this is in the very beginning of Book 8, introducing what is a long discussion of friendship that continues from Book 8 and Book 9. And certainly Luke's audience formed in the paideia, which is to say the educational philosophical program of the Greek world that the Romans adapted, would certainly be familiar with a classic like Aristotle. So I think this is worth listening to, so you can hear how the audience, Luke's Gospel, would have heard our passage. For friendship is a virtue, or involves virtue, and also it is one of the most indispensable requirements of life. For no one would choose to live without friends, but possessing all other good things. In fact, rich men, rulers, and potentates are thought especially to require friends, since what would be the good of their prosperity without an outlet for beneficence, which is displayed in its fullest and most praiseworthy form toward friends? And how could such prosperity be safeguarded and preserved without friends? For the greater it is, the greater is its insecurity. And in poverty or any other misfortune, men think friends are their only resource. Friends are an aid to the young, to guard them from error, to the elderly, to tend them, and to supplement their failing powers of action, to those in the prime of life, to assist them in noble deeds. So we hear there from Aristotle that friends are important at every level of life, age, or social class. But notice for the rich, who is certainly partly what's in view in Luke's Gospel, if not in this immediate story, for what good would be their prosperity without an outlet for beneficence? In other words, friends are there to show how rich you are. And we'll see more of that later when we look at the banquet scenes in chapter 14, where friend will also come up and Jesus will say, don't invite your rich friends. And we can hear Aristotle echoed that way. But the important point here is that for Luke's audience, friends were the key to life, and certainly that's especially for men. That a man's friend would perhaps even be more important, somebody you would express more intimacy with, than your wife. And a wife might be good for sex and good for social status and obviously good for producing children and the family, which especially in the Roman world was key. But what you really care about as an intellectual man, or really as a man who's not an intellectual, is your male friends. Sometimes that's still true in our society, sometimes not, but it certainly was in the Greek world at the time. So that's the context in which we enter in our story, and we see how Luke has used philos many times. We saw it around the question of centurion back in chapter 7, and we see Jesus accused of being a friend of tax collectors and sinners. We see it in our passage here, and we see it quite a number of times, including into Acts. So let's put the structure of our scene back up as we begin to enter into our story. So it begins, suppose, in the New RSV, although the Greek, as you can see down below, literally means which one out of you, or as some have suggested, can any of you imagine? So he's putting together a counterfactual situation for them, but one that he would expect them to experience. And many scholars have jumped into assuming, and I have to say that both Metzger and Nguyen do this, that this is a village context, and they probably got that from Bailey. I don't know for sure they got it from Bailey, but Bailey assumed that years before, and so did Herzog, whose book on parables and trying to read them apart from their placement in the gospel has been also influential. But I don't see anything in the story itself that suggests village. The location is not named. It doesn't say city or village. It just simply says a friend. And people could be living next to each other and have needs in many different contexts and not just in a village. So we simply don't know the context, and I'm not sure it's important. If Luke thought it was important, he probably would have said so. So he says, imagine you have a friend. And actually what he's saying is, imagine you have two friends, one inside and one outside. That goes a little bit to the inside-outside chart we looked at last time, but I won't bring that up now. Suppose one of you has a friend, and you go to him at midnight. What? Why would you go to your friend at midnight? And I want to slow this down to highlight how absurd the story is at many levels. At midnight. Some scholars have suggested, like Fitzmyer, that people traveled at night to avoid the heat of the day. But as others have noted, in Palestine or Lebanon, if that's what we're supposed to picture, where Jesus on his journey to Jerusalem, there'd be some elevation inland and a breeze that would keep it not that hot. And I think what Fitzmyer's doing there is trying to justify the text. Well, the story says he's there at midnight, so there must be some rational reason why he's there at midnight. But perhaps there's not. Perhaps the whole story is absurd, and that's part of the point, that Jesus is creating through Luke here an absurd story that would get the audience to laugh and remember it, and then realize that God is not like this neighbor. So they comes at midnight, and my note below is simply showing what you see on the right side, and say to him, and as Herzog notes, the midnight cry for help is not exactly a private conversation, it is also alerting the other villagers to his need. And again, that's highlighting the assumption that it's a village, although we don't know that. So he says friend here, and again, Fitzmyer noting the building up of the background of ancient Near Eastern hospitality with a reference to friends here. Although, as Herzog notes, the rhetoric of friendship can be assimilated to the institution of clientelism, which is to say the patron-client relationships that we see, especially in something like the Gospel of John, where Pilate is threatened by the Judean leaders, if you release this man Jesus, you are no friend of Caesar. So in that case, it's part of the patron-client relationship. But that's not what we're seeing in our story of neighbors here. So lend me 3 loaves of bread. The word for lend here, cresson, is only here in the New Testament. And as Marshall noted years ago, it does not suggest loan and interest, but rather providing what is needed. As Herzog adds here, it is an honor, not an annoyance, to be asked to contribute to an occasion that maintains the honor of the village. In doing so, the participants enhance the reputations of their families. And again, this is assuming a village, that a guest coming to somebody's house would be a guest coming to the whole village, and that everybody would see it as an honor or a dishonor, an honor to welcome or dishonor not to welcome. Notice, though, if we hear stories like the visitors to Lot in Sodom in Genesis 19, we see the neighbors aware of it, but they don't see exactly that it's an honor. They see that it's an invasion because they're city people. And perhaps that's one basis here for arguing that it's a village situation, that there's not a hostility to a stranger, as there would be if someone who came to a city in the night. So what he says here, lend or give me, as we say to people, hey, lend me something, when we really mean give it to me for now. 3 loaves of bread, which is probably just like pita bread. And if there's just one guest, although we don't know that yet, it's not until verse 6 that we hear how many guests he has, or even what the reason is for needing the bread. But 3 pieces of pita bread, which for a midnight snack would be a substantial amount. As my note below here has, that bread is not the meal, bread is the knife, fork, and spoon with which the meal is eaten. Everybody knows that he will also need to borrow the meal itself that will be eaten with the bread. But one might ask, why do we assume that the person asking doesn't have other food? In the classic Midwestern or perhaps small townish American style of going to your neighbor for a couple of sugar, presumably to make a dessert or something, you don't necessarily need the flour and the milk and the eggs, you just needed the sugar. So we can't assume that this person is completely bereft of food just because somebody showed up. They must have some food just as the person who's asking is presumed to have food. So we have to be careful not to assume more than what the text says. So he asks for something modest, and as Nguyen notices from a Vietnamese perspective, that kind of assumption always expects the person being asked to give much more. That it's just like saying, can I have a sip of water, and Rebecca waters all their camels in the book of Genesis. So it continues with the reason. For a friend of mine has arrived. Now literally has come to be beside me out of the way. It's an interesting circumlocution here to say that this person has arrived, and apparently someone unexpected. Either they were delayed or they weren't expecting them at all. Obviously, they couldn't email them or text them to let them know they were coming. So that could easily happen, that someone's on a journey or going to visit friends or relatives, and they don't know they're coming until they arrive, and this is when they happen to show up. We don't know how far they've come from or anything about that. Notice that there's a certain parallel to the Good Samaritan that we've looked at earlier, of somebody in need who's a stranger and to see who will take care of them. Very different situation, though, for someone who has a hungry friend and someone who's wounded and beaten on the side of the road. And I have nothing to set before him. And as Bailey notes, the crucial element in this initial portion of the parable, which he calls it, is that the guest is guest of the community, not just of the individual. And he adds, as long as the request is modest enough, refusal is unthinkable. In this case, the request is the humblest element of the entire meal. And I have nothing to set before him, and that links the story to chapter 10, as we saw, about the 70 being set out to eat whatever is set before them by whoever offers them hospitality. So we can sort of imagine this is a story of the disciples on the road receiving or not receiving hospitality from someone in one of the places they visit. So let's move the text down so we can see the whole rest of our scene here. And he answers from within, and literally that one, not being clear who it is inside, from within, more of the inside-outside we look at, and he says, do not bother me, or literally, don't give me troubles. As Marshall notes, a particularly inhospitable response from a quote-unquote friend. The requester has put the householder in a difficult position, either disturb the sleeping children or lose face as a hospitality refuser. But as my note further says, but who cares about the children's sleep in that social context? And many more recent scholars than Marshall have noted that the idea that he says the door has been locked or literally simply closed, and as Bailey notes, the hypothetical excuses suggested are so unthinkable as they are humorous. Notice that they'll be parallel to the unthinkable excuses of the wedding banquet. I can't come to your wedding, I bought some oxen that I have to check out. And so we'll see Luke makes that kind of humor in a couple of situations where people make absurd excuses that are obviously a dishonor to the person offering the invitation. So the door is closed and my children are with me in bed. Big deal. Notice there's no mention of the wife or anybody else there. It seems to suggest it's a small, if we take it literally, it's a small little village house with the children and the father all in one bed, although that was not unusual even for relatively wealthy people, not for kings, of course, but it doesn't mean you have to be poor. He says, I cannot get up and give you anything, which of course he can. He's simply choosing not to. And as my note below suggests, the give is contrasting with the request to lend. So now Jesus speaks up, but notice how the I here was the person in the story, and now the I is Jesus, without there being any apparent shift. The narrator hasn't interrupted and doesn't say, and then Jesus added. So there's a little shift there that might be subtle. I tell you, even though he will not get up or arise, and I note here the arise and this one are the two different words for a resurrection. Anastemi and a gero. So I don't hear that there's anything about resurrection immediately in this scene, but it certainly creates part of the chiasm you see there. So even though he will not get up and give anything because he is his friend, which is just absurd, as every scholar who reads his notes, there's no way that someone would not get up for a friend who's making the minimal request of just give me a couple pieces of pita bread and you can go back to bed, which would not be the implication. The implication would be, we have a visitor, let's come celebrate with me and you'll sleep later. But, of course, neither of those happen in the story. So at least because of his, and this is one of the worst translated words anywhere in Luke's Gospel, and every modern scholar agrees, it simply does not mean persistence. It means shamelessness. Neideia. The for a negative and neideia for shame, and there's no question at all. It comes from a literal sense of not lowering one's eyes. And so we have to pay attention to what that means. In this sense, shame is a positive notion. To have shame, which is different than to be shamed by others. I want to make that very clear. To have shame is to know when the appropriate time to speak and to act is. Someone who's shameless speaks and acts without considering whether what they're saying is appropriate or not. We might refer to it as somebody who's rude because they're speaking when it's not their turn, or they're saying things, as we say, they're saying the quiet part out loud. But it has to do with shamelessness. It has nothing to do with persistence. There aren't multiple requests here. This is not like the story of the judge and the widow in chapter 18. So just take the word persistence out of there and here it's shamelessness. But that still leaves the question of whose shamelessness? Is it the requester's shamelessness or the requestee's shamelessness? If it's the request E, shamelessness, which is the implication of the chart on the right, because if there's avoidance of shame, the implication would be that so he would not be perceived as a shameless person, he will in fact give the bread. To not give the bread would be perceived as someone who has no sense of the right behavior, that of course it's the proper behavior to get up and care for your friend and his friend, but it could be the requester's shamelessness. In other words, somebody who's on the suffering side, as Metzger pointed out, or the marginalized side, as Nguyen is pointing out, and is not shameless in the sense is not afraid to dare to speak out of turn, to avoid the social stigma that might come from someone of the lower class or an outsider group, to speak up and make their requests known. And so that's there to empower people who would otherwise be seen in the Greco-Roman world as too low on the pyramid or too far outside the circle, depending upon whether you see that vertically or horizontally, spatially, to be within the ambit of God's listening. So because of their shamelessness, he will get up and give him not just what he asked to borrow, but whatever he needs. And of course, that's exactly the point about what God is. And that's why it will continue in verse 9 and following with a more direct statement that is not exactly an allegorical explanation, but is certainly Jesus' understanding of the point of this little story that we've looked at. So we'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.